This morning, my question, why are so many people working so hard and still barely making it? Plus, the dozens of men starving to death on purpose. And what you don't know about political icon Angela Davis. But first, are you a good ally? Good morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. 48 years ago this month, Americans watched as video of the day that would become known as Bloody Sunday was broadcast live to television screens across the country. On March 7th, 1965, 600 people attempted a protest march from Selma, Alabama to the state capitol building in Montgomery to advocate for voting rights. And as the cameras rolled, these peaceful protesters, just 6 blocks into their march, were stopped at Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge and violently attacked by Alabama state troopers. The televised images of American citizens tear-gassed and beaten with clubs by agents of their own government sparked outrage as viewers across the country watched in horror. And among those was a woman who did more than just watch. She acted. After Bloody Sunday, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sent out the call for allies to come to Selma and stand with him in another march. And joining the people who answered that call was a married mother of 5 from Michigan named Viola Gregg Liuzzo. This 39-year-old Teamster's wife divided her time between raising her children, attending classes at a local university, and being an activist. She worked to bring attention to education and economic justice issues and was a member of the Detroit chapter of the NAACP. So Viola could have continued lending her support to the cause from the relative safety of the North. But only days before she arrived in Selma, Reverend James Reeb, a Boston minister, was beaten to death by a group of men armed with clubs. But still, Viola came, joining thousands of others who made the 4-day walk escorted by the National Guard from Selma to Montgomery. And during the march, Viola volunteered as a driver for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, shuttling marchers back and forth between the two cities. One night, she was driving, accompanied by a young black SCLC activist, when she was spotted by a group of KKK members. They pulled up next to her and shot her in the head, killing her instantly. This Monday was the 48th anniversary of Viola's death. And the day after she was killed, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the arrest of her murderers and spoke to the nation about her sacrifice.
Mrs. Liuzzo went to Alabama to serve the struggles for justice. She was murdered by the enemies of justice, who for decades have used the rope and the gun and the tar and the feathers to terrorize their neighbors.
Allies like Viola Liuzzo have always been essential as an element to the survival and success of any movement. People who could otherwise remain wrapped in the security of their privilege, but instead choose to align themselves with those who have no such safe haven. And a coalition that includes those who aren't the primary focus of a cause's agenda can strengthen a movement by pushing it from the margin to the mainstream, even when those allies are imperfect. Marriage equality advocates can be forgiven for not rolling out the rainbow carpet for Republican Senator Rob Portman when he recently announced his shift from adversary to ally. He'd already known for 2 years about the sexual orientation of the son who inspired his evolution. And though it remains risky for a Republican to endorse marriage equality, the political liability is lower now than it has ever been before, which makes Democrats jumping onto the bandwagon especially late to the party. As the most visible of the recent Democratic converts, both Hillary and Bill Clinton waited until the political winds of popular support were at their backs. These fair-weather allies certainly fall short of Dr. King's measure of a person. Not where you stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but at times of challenge and controversy. But the shift in the idea of marriage equality from radical extreme to ordinary acceptance may have less to do with what brings an ally to the table than what they do once they get there. So, a little primer on how to be a good ally. First, don't demand that those you are supporting produce proof of the inequality they are working to resist. Do recognize that the shield of your privilege may blind you to the experience of others' injustice. Don't offer up your relationship with a member of the marginalized group as evidence of your understanding. Do be open to learning and expanding your consciousness by listening more and talking less. And don't see yourself as the Kevin Costner in Dances with the Wolves or the Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai. You are not the savior riding to the rescue on a white horse. Do notice that you are joining a group of people who are already working to save themselves. And do realize that the only requirement you need to enter allyship is a commitment to justice and human equality. And do remember the example of Viola, whose most enduring contribution to the civil rights movement was not that she gave her life, but the way that she lived it. Before leaving Detroit for Selma, a friend reportedly warned her against the danger she might encounter. And in response, she said simply, "I want to be a part of it." At the table this morning, Dorian Warren, professor of political science and international and public affairs at Columbia University and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Rinku Sen is the president and executive director of the Applied Research Center and publisher of colorlines.com. Michael Skolnik is the political director to hip-hop pioneer Russell Simmons and the co-president of globalgrind.com. And Dave Zirin is sports editor for The Nation. All right, this is the work that you do, Rinku. What is your rule for being a good ally?
My first and number one rule really is to remember the last thing that you said, that the job of a good ally is not to save anybody, but rather to help create the conditions under which people can assert and grow their own power. And so that means making room for the voices of people. It means encouraging those voices to say what they need to say, and it means defending those people when they decide to assert that power and draw down all of the backlash that any assertion of power by an oppressed group of people draws down. So there is one exception to that rule, which is that if you are encountering someone who is in grave physical danger or is in under the kind of attack that really needs to be interrupted right in that moment.
You might, in fact, need to save.
You might think about that as a saving moment.
Right.
But otherwise, generally, what you're doing is making space, really, and providing defense. It's about being the flank rather than getting in front and preventing bad things from happening.
This point about making space, I have to say, when I've written a bit about this, when President Obama at the inauguration uses the language of talking about gay brothers and sisters, this is, to me, a kind of making space moment. Let's take a look at that.
Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well.
So, Michael, you have this amazing moment when the president has been making space, but then there's all these fascinating cultural moments that have followed. And you and I were just talking about your dear friend, who is someone I'm so impressed with on this allyship, Brendan Ayanbadejo from the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah, I think, Brendan and I go back to our UCLA days when we were just, young kids, and I've watched his growth as a tremendous ally to the LGBT community. But I think what the president was talking about and what Brendan sort of exemplifies is this idea that the rights that you take for granted are not valid unless you fight for the same rights for others, right? So when I stood up for Trayvon a year ago and just keep fighting for Trayvon, if I can walk down the street and put my hand out, a taxi cab will not pass me by. Right. If I can walk into a restaurant and no one's going to ask me to pay before I eat. If I can walk through my neighborhood with a hoodie on and a pair of sneakers and no one's going to call the police and say I look suspicious, then I have to fight for those young black and brown young men to be able to have those same rights that I have.
Right. So that role of ally is in part about a recognition that you do exist in a world of privilege.
Absolutely. I mean, I think especially as a white male American, my grandma used to take me to the racing track when I was a kid. She said, bet on, win, play, show, the perfect trifecta. I got the lotto. I hit the lotto.
Yeah, right. You're a straight white guy.
Straight white guy, American. And so with that, I got privilege. I got to do something with it.
Right. Dave, this question of, Brendan and others within the league, it looks like, to me, that part of where we're going to have to go, particularly on the question of queer Americans, our gay brothers and sisters, our trans brothers and sisters, is when folks who sort of represent the most normative, straight white men or very masculine black men that we see in sports, for example, when they're the ones who are acting as allies. And we've seen this before, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes it so important when athletes, for example, do submit a brief to the Supreme Court saying we stand for LGBT marriage equality. That's why it was so important with the role that Brendan played in the state of Maryland on a local initiative, on a local statewide referendum. And Chris Cluey, who also went to UCLA, conspiracy, I don't know, but Chris Cluey, the punter for the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, Chris Cluey was crisscrossing the state, speaking out for marriage equality in advance of a statewide referendum. It makes a huge difference when people, because let's face it, sports is one of the ways in which masculinity is socialized. And so when you have people who say, well, wait a minute, my definition of masculinity is not necessarily heteronormative, then that's something that actually has, I think, a tremendous power. And it speaks to what I think is very important when we talk about what it means to be a good ally. I think part of it also has to be saying to people, you're not doing this out of pity and you're not doing this out of charity. You have to see it as also self-interest, because we are a better society if young black children in Chicago can have a good education and go to good schools. We are a better society if our LGBT brothers and sisters can live out and in peace. We're a better society if our sisters, our daughters, our mothers can feel safe when they go out at night. That is a better world that we should aspire to live in.
I like this point, Dave. Dorian, it feels to me like, part of what will sometimes happen in this question of being a good ally is when other movements are called on to be allies. So we've seen, for example, some resistance in racial civil rights movements to allying with LGBT movements. And then we see the president making space, lots of folks coming on board. But then I want to say, all right, HRC, all right, GLAAD, can you guys now have to make that a reciprocal ally relationship? I'm going to need you standing for Trayvon Martin. I'm going to need you standing for voting rights. How do we make those calls between organizations that both need allies?
It's a simple principle. It's an old union principle of solidarity.
Right.
An injury to one is an injury to all. And if we can imagine ourselves in any situation thinking of that one rule, what can I do in this situation to be in solidarity with someone who is being injured, whether through systemic oppression or whether it's through an individual human action? What is my responsibility as a human being to ensure that another human being's dignity is not put down upon? And so I just think solidarity should be a fundamental principle between movements as well as between people.
Yeah, a good union principle. I love that. We love having you here, Dorian. Stay right there, because when we come back, there is somebody working on exactly that good old union principle, the pastor who made marriage equality his mission. When we're back.